everyone, and welcome to our 6,000 subscriber question and answer special. There's 82 comments I see logged on YouTube, so it's going to take some time, and let's get on with it. So our first one is from JTH Bassist. How much is confidently known of Rocket's physical appearance circa Wren Hill, and how accurate is our modern image of Rocket? Well, we know an awful lot about Rocket's appearance at Wren Hill thanks to a scale measured drawing made at the time by Charles Black of Vignoles, which was published in the Mechanics magazine in October 1829, and from the notebook kept by John Rastrick, one of the three Wren Hill judges, and he drew and measured each of the Wren Hill contenders. So he drew and measured Rocket, Samparai, Novelty, as well as the Cycloped. So we know what Rocket definitely looked like at Wren Hill in 1829. The replica of Rocket built 2009-2010, which is now at the NRM Museum up at Shildon, is the most accurate depiction of Rocket to date. The section replica of Rocket on display at the NRM made in the 1930s is wrong, as it depicts Rocket having a steam dome and an internal steam pipe, which it did not have at Wren Hill. The shape of the firebox is incorrect, and it also shows it with beautifully machined brass pistons, and it certainly didn't have those. J.K. de Koning, what is your favourite railway? And what is your favourite steam engine and your favourite double-O gauge model? I don't model in double-O gauge, I model in 16mm scale narrow gauge, live steam out in the garden. If I had a favourite double-O gauge model, the Stirling single is absolutely gorgeous. Favourite steam engine, Planet, Stirling single, or the NA-class Baldwins on the Puffing Billy in Australia. Favourite railway, probably the Great Northern Railway in Britain. But that makes me a bit of a traitor, as one of my ancestors was station master at Snaith on the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. Crazy Pickles asks about Planet. Question close to my heart. What was it like to operate Planet? Delightful, unless it was cold or raining, when you get absolutely sopping wet. She is a pleasure to fire, she's also a pleasure to drive, so long as you understand how the valve gear works, having to start off setting the valve timing by hand, using the levers in the foot plate and then locking it in. And if you're wanting to slow down, you need to judge the time quite accurately to change direction with the foot pedal, and there's a couple of times that in Manchester I've been driving it, especially bringing it back into the platform, in reverse, where I've put it into forward gear to slow it down and coast it to a stop, and I've stopped short, and that means having to faff about, put it into, get the train moving, which has been reverse, change gear, move it. It's, complicated, but lovely. Does she burn wood or coal? She's a coal burner. She burns Welsh coal perfectly. She's not got a brick arch, burns Welsh coal without any smoke. Absolutely gorgeous, just beautiful, beautiful locomotive. Uniquely mediocre. Bridges, rail ferries. I am not a civil engineer, so I don't feel qualified to talk about bridges. Shannon, probably, but it's one heck of a trek from Manchester to Didcot to go and get any photographs or footage of it, so it is a probably. A.B. Ahmed, when did your love for locomotives start? And what do you love about them? I blame my mum. She was a railway enthusiast. She and my father owned shares in an LMS 8F, which lived in a coal yard in Wakefield. And supposedly, one of the stories when they were buying their first house together was there a sufficiently large drive to put it on? Mother said no. So Mum, my brother and I, the dog, had lots of trips to the National Railway Museum in York, lots of trips to the Keighley and Worth Valley or the North Yorkshire Moors, and the dog had a dog ticket at one point. What do I love about them? It's that they seem alive, this big, hot, steaming, hissing, sizzling machine where you can feel the heat, the warmth radiating off them. They're unpredictable, they're unique. There's just something very special and almost magical about them. There's a sort of elemental quality to them, bringing together earth, water, air, and fire. William Adams asks about the British legacy in the colonies, including the Antipodes, and whether any examples of people or ideas from the former empire who made a significant contribution to the development of the network back in the UK. There's not so much engineers coming back, but rather British engineers bringing back ideas. So, for example, the Worsdals, who worked for the North Eastern Railway, worked in America for a while, and they brought back full cabs with them. And Herbert William Garrett, of course, worked in South America, and he was the man who came up with the idea for the Garrett articulated locomotive. BPS&D asked about George and Robert Stephenson and their knighthoods. George was offered a knighthood twice, and he turned it down twice. George was someone who we describe now as a radical. He was very much left-wing in politics. He had very little time for the political system of his day. He had very little time for the establishment with a capital E of the day. And this is what he said about his knighthood. I have had the honour of knighthood on my own country made to me several times, but would not have it. I have been invited to become a Fellow of the Royal Society and also of the Civil Engineers, but I objected to these empty additions to my name. I have, however, now consented to become president of a highly respectable Mechanics Institute in Birmingham. So he believed things like a knighthood were absolutely worthless. They meant nothing, and they meant nothing to a working man. And Robert Stephenson, even though he became a Tory MP, similarly refused a British knighthood. Although both George and Robert were Chevaliers of the Légion d'honneur in France and Belgium and had various international honours bestowed on them, which they accepted because of things like the Légion d'honneur were far more meritocratic than the British honours system. Jeff Smith asks about railway advertising. Railways from the beginning, particularly the Liverpool and Manchester, attracted advertisers from the very, very beginning. With people like William Cornish publishing Travellers and Strangers Guides to the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, publishing the timetable and describing what went on in the journey. And they also had advertisers of various public houses, shops and businesses you could find on the line. So railway advertising goes right back to 1830. The Liverpool and Manchester Trust asked about George Stephenson. Was he a nice person? Swig of coffee and a little bit of merch there. He had a very strong will and an iron character. He had a tremendous strength of character. He was very good at seeing ideas. He was very good at being a self-publicist. He was also very good at using others' ideas and adopting them for himself and claiming the credit. Whether he was a nice person, I'm not actually sure. He would have been one of those people whose personality would have filled a room. He was very charismatic, if rather shy and hesitant, until late in life as a public speaker. Samuel Smiles gives him a lot of credit for things such as working at Killingworth on the locomotive, where he worked in a team, and indeed George admits he worked as part of a team in old age. So he gave some credit, but I don't think he was a nice, cuddly person. He was someone with a very strong will, very strong personality, and not particularly nice. Very strong character, very strong-willed, someone who was determined to get his own way, but unlike someone like Brunel, he did listen to other people, where Brunel was incredibly arrogant, thought he was the most intelligent person in the room, and won't take any advice from anybody. One also has to look at the disaster of the atmospheric railway. No one could make it work. Brunel said, I'll be able to make it work because I'm Brunel. And both teams are going like, really? Really? It's not going to work. Yeah, strong will, big personality, not terribly nice. This is a duck! Exclamation mark. Were there any experimental pneumatic locomotives that used compressed air? Yes, they were. In France, Antoine Andro and Cyprien-Marie Tessy-Dumortet, they developed the first compressed air locomotive in 1840. It was a four-wheel 022 rail car. And the reservoir was kept warm with a small fire, and they advocated it as a safer alternative to a steam locomotive. Antoine Andron, he then developed the idea further in 1844, building a 5-ton 222 locomotive. It was a big cigar-shaped thing and 6 wheels. From memory, the compressed air in the reservoir was about 300 psi. And the problem with that was it had to be pressurised by hand. It was trialled in Paris. It worked without smoke, worked with very little noise. It was far cheaper to operate than a conventional locomotive. But the drawback was pressurising the reservoir up to 300 psi. JS Gaming. What is your favourite early locomotive? Planet, but then I'm biased. Why you like early locomotive? Again, I blame my mum. When she was trying to be a teacher, she did a whole class on the birth of the railways. So there's a lot of stuff about early railways in the house at that time. And I have a very distinct memory of a while ago now, when it was the Great Western 150th, going to the NRM with my mum and bro. No dog in tow this time. Going to see the replica of Iron Duke and seeing that in steam at the NRM. And seeing it in steam alongside Rocket and being absolutely fascinated. Not only by the size of the thing, but by the wooden boiler. Well, at least the wooden boiler cladding. But to a 5-year-old, the boiler did look like it was wooden. And then it was like nothing else I'd seen in the preserved railway. Major Magna, if money no object, you could choose a working replica train, loco plus carriage wagon to be built. What would you go for? I'd have another Planet, to be honest. Maybe a Samson, the 040 version, because it's a bit different, it's a bit more useful, it's got more attractive effort. So Planet, maybe Lion, and a train of replica Liverpool or Manchester carriage to go behind it. I'd love to see that. Muddy Axles ask about the subject of Tiny, the only broad gauge locomotive. Again, I'd love to do it, but from where I'm in Manchester and rely on public transport, it's one heck of a trek. Kyle Pennypacker asks about Tom Thumb was the first American engine. We all know there's a bleep, with Tom Thumb being the first. It depends how we're defining first American engine. First locomotive of any kind, it was probably that vertical boiler job that ran in a circle with a racked drive, but the steam wagon. But US built, probably best friend of Charleston, maybe. There needs to be a lot more research on early American locomotives, particularly for American built. British imports have got Pride of Newcastle and Starbridge Lion. And then the first ones to operate, the first American-built one, it's such... Again, it needs a lot more research to find out. ICW 15. Which of the big four is your favourite? None of them. SAFTA. My interest in railway stops about 1860, 1870. It's all far too new. Salut Henri Leroy. J'ai déjà couvert plusieurs locomotives françaises sur mon chaîne YouTube dans Marseguin, Saint-Pierre, César. Je ferai plus à l'avenir. Jennifer Garrett, is Ajax a large Samsung type? Yes, it is. Built to the same design. It was also built in Britain, this time in the northwest. So, yep, it's a relative of line. It's the same design. Surliv. Question: what topic of research, be it locomotive, person, company, or broader topic, as you pulling your hair out and screaming into throw pillows with frustration? Quite a lot of it, to be honest. Quite a lot of it. One of my regular moments is people saying, "Oh, you can steam line. None of it's original if it all wasn't built in 1838. Ah, steam it. Oh, no, that's not the point. Yes, it ran until the 1980s, but most of the locomotive dates before 1865. The problem with this is an issue of conservation, restoration, and preservation. The locomotive was preserved. Yes, it was mangled in the 1930s, but much of that restoration work was obvious, such as the stupid cover of the firebox, the springs and wheel splashes in the homemade's tender. So it's entirely reversible and it's demonstrable. You can see what they added to it. You can take it back to the form in which it was preserved in the 1920s. The problem is taking away any historic fabric from these things, even if it's during their working life, you are reducing the authenticity of the artifact. Historic railway locomotive is rather like a piece of cake. You can have it today, you can have it tomorrow. Sorry, you can have it today, but you can't have it tomorrow. As soon as you start removing historic fabric from a locomotive, be it Lion or be it a BR Standard 5, you are reducing the amount of information available to researchers in the present and researchers in the future. So we always have to bear in mind, with preservation and with conservation, that what we do today will have an impact on tomorrow and the researchers and the academics of tomorrow. So with a locomotive like Lion, giving it a new boiler, new wheels, new crank axle, you'd be basically left with nothing of the original machine. You'd have a pastiche, you'd have a facsimile, from which there would be very little to learn from. Another pet peeve is seeing enginemen wearing top hats and footplates. It's not possible. We've tried it, they fall off, they get in the way. Or the assumption that the Liverpool and Manchester locomotives were all painted Dayglow yellow because Rocket was at the Rainhill trials, when there is abundant evidence from the Liverpool and Manchester Railway archive the locomotives were painted dark green, and even the wooden boiler cladding was painted green. All the polished wooden boiler cladding, all the brasswork and fancy work is a product of the 1920s. It's a 20th century bit of assumption of what early locomotives would look like. They were far more workmanlike, with lots of, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, all the bright work was all to be painted with black varnish, so you wouldn't have shiny boiler bands, you wouldn't have had shiny this, that and the other. Be kept clean, they be kept workmanlike. They wouldn't look like, as Brunel described them, an ornament to the finest drawing room. Bonus question: if you're in the mood, someone to make an ultimate railway game to capture the construction, development, operations of railways as a whole and completely as possible, what features would you like to see? And that would be the signalling. And the correct operation of something like Planet or Rocket, having to waggle the hand levers and use the foot pedal to change gear and so forth. How you would do that on a train, some have no idea. But the signalling, having little men with flags every mile to control the signalling rather than semaphores, make it far more interesting experience. BPNSD again. What patents held back the development of the steam engine? Yes, they did. Boulton and Watt painted the steam locomotive, and that held back the development of the steam engine, the stationary engine, because they took anybody to court if they tried to build a steam engine, because their patent was sufficiently broad as to cover not just the Boulton and Watt condensing engine, but the very concept of a steam engine. Boulton was incredibly litigious. He was a bit of a bleep when it came to business. Another one of these very driven businessmen who could see a business opportunity and money and everything. Watt was far more laid back, a bit more prosaic about it, but Boulton pretty much would take you to court if you built anything approaching a steam engine of the stationary kind. Boulton and Watt wouldn't stand any rivals. We know in Leeds, where Matthew Merry established a round foundry, they sent spies to find out what they were doing, and they bought up all the land around the round foundry in Leeds to stop them actually expanding their foundry. When it came to Trevithick, he developed his high-pressure steam engine, which didn't have a condenser. Boulton and Watt hated this idea, and Trevithick actually patented his use of strong steam in 1802. Boulton and Watt set out to sabotage Trevithick by claiming it was unsafe. They claimed their low-pressure condensing engines were the only type of engine to be built, that they were safe. So Boulton and Watt, well, at least particularly Boulton, spread rumours that these things were dangerous, they were prone to exploding, and they cited examples of them exploding to sabotage Trevithick, and they did a lot of dirty work against Trevithick. So yes, Watt's patent held back the development of the steam engine. They took anybody and everyone to court who built a copy of it, an unlicensed copy of it, or who tried to modify the design. Thankfully, their patent lapsed, but they were very good at renewing their patent. So yes, they did hold back the evolution of the steam engine. Kinetic Rail asks about Rocket. The whole point of the Rainhill trials wasn't to find the best locomotive, but to find the best form of motive power. The whole point of the Rainhill trials was to assess if the locomotive was as good a form of motive power for a railway as a series of stationary engines and ropes. The jury was out because no one had yet worked a railway entirely by locomotives. The Stockton and Darlington had locomotive-worked sections with inclined planes and they used horses. George Stephenson's first railway, designed for mechanical traction, the Hetton Railway of 1822, also used stationary engines with rope haulages and locomotives. No one had yet run a locomotive over 30 miles, and the jury was out whether locomotives or stationary engines were better. So if Rocket hadn't prevailed at Rainhill, the whole future of the Liverpool and Manchester and the future of railways would have been delayed, because it's likely the Liverpool and Manchester Railway would have gone with stationary engines to work their railway. George Stephenson, Robert Stephenson and Henry Booth would have continued to champion the locomotive. They would have eventually produced a super rocket, and they would have demonstrated that the locomotive was better. But rather like the Canterbury and Whitstable, which opened just before Liverpool and Manchester, again that had stationary engines and ropes, as the Leicester and Swannington did, that the locomotive had to be categorically superior to the stationary engine. So if Rocket hadn't run, you'd have probably had a situation like the Stockton and Darlington, like the Canterbury and Whitstable, and like the Leicester and Swannington, where you had locomotives on the level sections and then winding engines up and down the gradients, particularly at Rainhill. And we do know the Liverpool and Manchester Railway had placed orders and the foundations were in place for the winding engines for the summit at Rainhill. It would have been a very different railway, and it wouldn't have been the first modern railway as we understand it. In fact, the Liverpool and Manchester, of course, did use winding engines at the Liverpool end, and the first railway, mainline passenger railway to be built and operated solely by locomotives without stationary engines was the Leeds and Selby Railway, which opened in September 1834 between Leeds and Selby. Surveyed and engineered by James Walker. because Stephenson had originally surveyed that in the 1820s and he'd recommended stationary engines. So even though Rocket had prevailed at Wren Hill and the Liverpool and Manchester was 90% locomotive worked, it still had the stationary engines at Liverpool. And of course, when the extension to the Manchester and Leeds Railway was worked, going up Miles Platting, there were stationary engines at the other end of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway as well. So if Rocket hadn't prevailed, the railway as a whole would have been very, very different. Jared Herbert. Ooh, blimey, there's a lot here. More coffee. What are some of your favourite liveries, steam or diesel or UK or elsewhere? It's Great Northern. The two-tone Larkin dark green is absolutely stunning. I love it. Diesel livery, I think it's early BR green or the LMS Twins in black and chrome. Again, absolutely stunning. What heritage railways would you recommend anyone visit at least once? Foxfield, obviously, although I am biased. North Yorkshire Moors, the Severn Valley, the Bluebell Railway, Taliesin in Wales, the Welsh Pool and Llanfair, and the Little Corris. Any favourite railway memories? Yes. Back when I was in Manchester at the Science Museum, and I have witnesses to the effect, and I was doing a trainee guard's turn, and I went to cook my lunch on the shovel of Edgecroft, those little mini Melton Mowbray pork pies. Those who know me and know this story will know exactly what is coming next. So I got my little pork pies on the shovel and opened the firebox doors, wound the blower on a couple of turns, stop it all coming back in my face, popped the shovel on the firebox, ring, dumpy, cook. Next thing I noticed was floating past the cab window the charred remains of my lunch, a little pork pie en flambé, little charred husk falling past the cab window. The blower had been on just a little bit too high, sucked my lunch off the shovel, through the boiler tubes, out of the chimney, and deposited it past the window around like burning black snow. Suffice to say that the entire footplate crew fell off the engine, convulsed with hysterics. And because we're all fans of the Goon Show. If you don't know what the Goon Show is, it's from the 1950s with Spike Milligan, Peter Sellers, Harry Seacombe, and for a time Michael Benty. It's basically Monty Python on the radio. And they did an episode called The Dreaded Batter Pudding Hurler of Bexhill-on-Sea, where someone, Count Moriarty, the friend of Hercule Grippipe Thin, goes around throwing batter puddings at people from his gas stove. And for the rest of the day, we couldn't help but go, Henry, I've been struck down from behind, with batter puddings. So forevermore, I'm now the dreaded pork pie hurler of Liverpool Road. One of those things where you just had to be there, but one of the things when you mention it, everyone just convulses. One of those things that could only ever happen on a preserved railway, and only probably happened to me, the famous railway hobbit. Ajax Engine Co. Throughout the early years of railways, technology moved quickly. Two examples to which I draw attention being the brick arch for coal burning and the life steam injector. And yes, the injector, invented Monsieur Henri Giffard for a steam zeppelin, does indeed work with witchcraft and wizardry. The brick arch was very quickly adopted because it presented cost saving to the railways. Before the brick arch was invented, railways were burning coke, and coke was expensive. In some cases, it was double the price of coal. A load of engineers like James McConnell or Beatty had invented all these very complicated coal-burning boilers to burn coal without making smoke, because all railways had a clause in the Act, like the Liverpool and Manchester, that you would be fined £50 per incident of making black smoke. That meant they had to burn coke. So Matthew Kirtley's brick arch caught on very quickly, as it presented cost savings for railways. The injector also caught on quite quickly, at least in Britain and in France. It was distrusted in America, where they stuck to having pumps, crosser-driven pumps, and instead of water gauges with a glass tube and a protector and 3 cocks, they stuck to having tricocks, very old-fashioned, very dangerous method, instead of having a gauge glass. And we know gauge glasses go back to the 1820s, as Aganoria, which is now on display at the National Rail Museum in York, and Rocket had gauge glasses. Steve M4, which would win in a fight, 3 Planets or One-Eyed Duke? One-Eyed Duke, it'd run over them. Will Powell, do you have any interesting thoughts on Ross Winans? Ross Winans, interesting, yes, very interesting man. Someone who was nearly shot in the American Civil War. He did support the wrong side. He had his own very unique ideas on locomotive development. He did have an entry at Rainhill, this man-powered cranked manumotive thing. Wasn't scared to do things his own way, but in that meant the railways he worked for wasted an awful lot of money pursuing his weird locomotive designs, and particularly his weird fireboxes to burn soft coal and anthracite, where you end up with camelbacks with a little tiddly cab on top, where the driver is roasted to death on top of the boiler. It's massive anthracite or soft coal boiler, and the little fireman stuck at the back, trying to get as much heat out of anthracite coal and poor quality coal as possible. Very clever, but again, a dead end in terms of locomotive development. Andrew Johnson asked about early railway locomotives and how they failed to last. Most of them failed due to the financial situation of the period. Companies like Matthew Murray's ran foundry in the 1790s, but they went bust in the 1840s due to the economic downturn. Same with other smaller concerns. It wasn't due to product choice or being outcompeted by larger concerns. It was due to downturns in the national economies, where it wasn't cost effective to build locomotives and railway companies were unable to build new locomotives. Court Ford asked about least and most favourite locomotives I've worked on. Most favourite has got to be Planet, because she is lovely. Again, I'm totally biased. Rapidly followed by Rocket, and then Bertie Peacock. Foxfield, least favourite, the Beatty Well Tank. When that arrived in Manchester, I'm not kidding, it was filthy black. You couldn't tell the brass portholes on the cab windows were brass. They were absolutely filthy. There was crud on the wheels this thick, which had to be scraped off with scrapers. Filthy black, horrible thing. It took about 4 of us 2 days to get it to clean and to exhibition standard. It was absolutely worn out. The water tank underneath leaked like a sieve. You'd fill it up and it'd trickle out everywhere. The injectors desperately needed new cones. They were temperamental, to say the least. And the really weird bit of it, the steam supplies for the injectors went the wrong way. So instead of lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, it was righty-loosey, lefty-tighty. It was very confusing, especially for like me, you're dyspraxic. It caught me out every single time. It's like, I don't like this. Xanthin Zada. What is the most successful steam engine which did not follow the principle set by Rocket? That's very probably the return flue jobs built by Hackworth up in the northeast for the Stockton, Darlington and elsewhere, or the rather peculiar plateway locomotives built by Neath Abbey and so forth for the plateways in South Wales. Mr. James Conductor, thanks for the congratulations. What's your opinion on early locomotive liveries versus modern interpretations? I think the colours are too bright. With Rocket, that was painted with chrome yellow, and chrome yellow is not quite the canary yellow we see of the replica, which has been painted with modern paints using modern synthetic pigments. For most of the 19th century, they were painted using natural pigments, and often using laser pigment mixed with a natural carrier like turpentine, and then they would have been varnished with a vegetable varnish, again mixed with turpentine. So the colours wouldn't have been as bright, and they would have a slightly brown hue to them because of the layers of varnish. So if you look at something, the replica Rocket is very bright yellow. In 1829 it wouldn't be quite so garish, and the type of yellow paint would have gone brown quite quickly because of the heat and sulfides. And as I mentioned earlier, all this polished wooden boiler lagging, all the lots of brass and fancy work, it wouldn't have happened had it been painted. It makes it a lot easier to maintain. So all this polished wood, all the polished bright work and fancy work, it's a modern interpretation of what we think early locomotives look like. They look toy-like with all these primary colours, and they weren't quite so garish. Ted Morland asks about the token system and how it originated in Britain. Yes, it did come out of time interval working, where you had signalmen with a lamp and flags every mile on the line who had an hourglass, and they would time the interval, turning it over when a train had passed to ensure 20 minutes was maintained between each train going past. If it was train appeared within that interval, they'd slow it down, or they would stop it until the interval had transpired. Relies on excellent timekeeping of the locomotive crew, the guard and the signalmen to be on their duty all the time. Token system can only come about when you have the electric telegraph, so you can communicate between each signal box that train A has left signal box B, is en route to signal box C, allowing train Z to enter the section. Liverpool and Manchester had a very early version of token system, where the policeman would give up his truncheon, which was then called the constable's wand or staff, and it was his badge of office, often very highly decorated. Pass that to the engineman going past to say, you have passed me at the right time, you're safe to enter the next section. Next train comes along, gets hand back a truncheon, then he passes it on to the next one, and so forth. So it all originates with the Cook and Wheatstone with electric telegraph, being able to signal between signal boxes, break the line up into sections, and work it as a block system. And when you're doing that, you need something like Liverpool and Manchester did to pass to a driver, say you're safe to enter this section. You've had a token handed back in saying that I have left. You can then hand it to someone else saying it is now safe to proceed. So it's all to do with the electric telegraph, as well as finding problems with time interval working. That modelling bloke, did anyone propose a locomotive before Trevithick? Yes, they did. A chap called Major Nicolas Cugnot in France. It was a road locomotive, and he built it in 1769. In fact, he built 3 of them. Cugnot was an officer in the Corps d'Artillerie Française. He was a French artillery officer, and this was a 3-wheeler designed to haul heavy gun barrels and heavy gun carriages. It was designed to use by the army to pull heavy field guns to free up horses. Cugnot died in relative obscurity, but he was afforded a pension by the Emperor Napoleon Ier, and one of his machines was preserved in the Conservatoire des Arts et Métiers in Paris, and it's on display today. So Cugnot in France was running around with steam road locomotives 30 years before Trevithick came along with his own road and rail locomotives. Trains, kits and other bits ask about double heading on Liverpool and Manchester. They did do it in the very early days, 1830 to 1831. But as I show in my book, Liverpool and Manchester Railway in Operating History, the Liverpool and Manchester did not like double heading because it put too much strain on locomotives and particularly on the coupling chains. So they had a maximum train weight of 100 imperial tons gross, and if a train was at 100 tons or over 100 tons, they would divide that train and would run it as two trains in short succession. When it came to working trains up the inclined planes, they had banking engines like Lion, which were on duty to shove it from the back. And again, they would divide the train into two sections, put one half in the siding. The banking engine would work the train up to the top. The banking engine, the locomotive, would uncouple, run back down the incline, they'd take up the second half, would then be coupled together at the top, and the train would continue on its way. Luke Mendel, what is your favourite steam tram? The Bayer Peacocks built for the Glyn Valley Tramway. Matthew Timzishin, can you tell us about romantic poet E.G. William Wordsworth backlanced against steam trains? Yes, they were opposed to the railways because they were invasive and they destroyed natural beauty. There were campaigns against railways in the Lake District, which is an area of outstanding natural beauty to this day, and running through the Derbyshire Peak District, the Derbyshire Dales, because they were invasive, because they were ugly, and because they brought a totally alien way of life to these largely rural areas. They brought with them modernity, they brought with them London time, they brought with them hordes of tourists, and people like Wordsworth and other critics of the railways thought that would destroy natural beauty of these areas and destroy traditional ways of life. Max Z, you're asking about exporting standard gauge engines all over the world to help jumpstart other countries. But did Britain import locomotives from other countries for the railways? Yes, we did. As Reverend Wilbert Awdry, yes, the Reverend Wilbert Awdry says in his History of the Birmingham-Gloucester Railway, the Birmingham-Gloucester imported all those locomotives from Norris of Philadelphia to work their railway, particularly the notoriously steep Lickey Incline. And towards the end of the 19th century, due to Britain's railway manufacturers being at capacity, companies like the Great Northern and the Midland imported locomotives from Baldwin, and I think Ulco about 1900, 1901, as they had a locomotive crisis, they needed more locomotives, so they imported American locomotives. Also worth mentioning that the Midland Railway, under Sir James Oldport, also imported American carriages. He had an excellent relationship with George Mortimer Pullman, and the Midland imported Pullman carriages into Britain. In kit form, they were built at Derby, and they were operated by the Midland Railway, but they weren't terribly popular with the British public because they were open plan carriages, and the British public preferred carriages, and the sleeping cars imported from Pullman were also also open plan with a drop-down beds closed off with curtains. And again, the British travelling public thought this quite objectionable, but again quite popular in France. And the Belgian chap with the unlikely name Georges Nagelmacher developed the Compagnie Internationale du Wagon Lit to build the European version of the Pullman. Thomas Shafter, 5 questions. Early stories about anthropic trains before the railway series. Yes, I remember reading one that my great aunt had about a locomotive called the Duchess, probably from the 1920s. A Victorian locomotive, a bit like Casey Jr., in as much as the cylinders and the steam pipes were the hands and she used opera glasses. I can't tell you any more about that, but I have a distinct memory of it. When was the first British rail train ever hauled? And that was Queen Victoria on the Great Western, going to Windsor. It was hauled by a locomotive called, I think it was the Ixion. Prince Albert enjoyed it immensely, but Queen Victoria was not terribly happy about the railways, and particularly travelling at speed. And during her life, she had very opinions about rail travel, and she was definitely not amused by high-speed travel. Conversely, her European equivalent, l'Impératrice Eugénie of France, was an adrenaline junkie, and the faster the better, I'm afraid. Do you know any ghost stories during the early railway days? No, but there are plenty of Victorian ghost stories, the most famous of which is by Charles Dickens, called The Signalman. Go and find it. It's wonderful. The BBC did a dramatisation of it on the Severn Valley in the 1980s. If you can find it, watch it. It's a wonderful bit of psychological thriller. Jason Weckler asked about valve gear. The most complicated of, oh my god, that's a headache, is that developed by Richard Roberts. He used it on his locomotive, the Experiment, and his other peculiar bell crank locomotives built for the Dublin and Kingstown Railway. It was derived from stationary or marine practice, and oh lordy, it is complicated. It allows expansive working, and it is just a horrendous nightmare of a thing. Did pre-grouping railways have head codes? Asked Paleo Potato. Yes, they did. And again, as in most things mainline railways, they start with the Liverpool and Manchester. The Liverpool and Manchester originated the custom of a white light at the front and a red light at the back of the train. And if you can't see the red lamp at the back, it means the train has become divided and the railway constable had to stop it. On the Liverpool and Manchester, if you were running towards Liverpool, you showed a green lamp, and if you were running towards Liverpool, a white lamp, or the other way around. When you got to trains running through from Birmingham, Liverpool and Manchester trains had a different head code to the Grand Junction trains, and companies like the London North Western, Great Northern, etc., they all had their own system of unique lamp codes to identify the type of train that was being worked. Simon Fink asks about early roads from non-European companies. Yes, but it's finding the sources and it's finding the images or the film footage to work from. I would love to, but it's just finding the data. I'm covering English locomotives because I am Anglophonic, covering French because I'm Francophone, and a couple of German locomotives. I'll be looking at German engines, but I haven't done German since GCSE, and I'm just a little bit, ein bisschen rusty. And last not but least, before I lose my voice. So, I was playing Railway Empire as Lautan Bintang Empatlima, doing Great Britain and Ireland DLC, downloadable content, and there's some GWR broad gauge locomotives, the Iron Duke, but it's blue. Well, I've had a bit of a think about this, and whilst Swindon turned out their engines in green, the Wolverhampton workshops, they turned their engines out in blue-green in the 1840s. And a little bit of looking through my books, the 3-volume history of the broad gauge engines, shows that some of them, particularly the Star-class tank engines, were indeed painted blue. But I've not come across any evidence of Iron Duke painted blue. but I will note that the border cladding, even of Iron Duke, North Star and so forth, that should have also been painted green rather than polished wood. It's one of the 1920s isms coming about from the full-size replica using some of the bits from North Star. And incidentally, that is one of the questions asked on Facebook, and that's one of the biggest crimes, railway crimes, was the scrapping by William Stanier of Lord of the Isles and North Star about 1900 because he wanted more room in his shed. So, that's it from me. Thank you all for your questions. And I have to say they're really informed questions, and there's what I can only describe as an early railways, a 19th century railway community, which has grown up around this channel over the last 2 and a bit years. It's amazing to think Rail Story's only been going for just over 2 years. Thank you for supporting this channel, for 6,000 of you subscribing to it, and I'm sure many more of you are watching it who aren't subscribed. If not, subscribe today. I hope I've been able to answer all your questions in as much detail as possible. If you would like more of these Q&A sessions, drop me a comment below. In fact, if you would like a live, say once a month, once a quarter, also let me know. We can start building this community with Q&A questions like this. I've enjoyed doing it. I hope you enjoy this video, and I look forward, as is traditional, to seeing you all next time on Rail Story.